Today on the Angel of Words podcast, don't be fooled by the microscopes that she's got. She's still Linda from the block. Clinical research expert Linda Monterroso will be here to discuss some scientific things that I really need to know about on deck on the Angel of Words podcast. Hello and welcome to the Angel of Words podcast. And on the line with me right now, I have amazing Yankee fan and scientist of the study of clinical research, Miss Linda Monterroso. Bienvenidos. Hello, Linda. How are you?
Hi, Angel. Well, thank you.
Thanks for joining us here today on the Angel of Words podcast.
It's an honor, actually. Thank you.
Oh, well, you're welcome. Now, Linda, I want to hop right into it. Okay, because, you know, there's a lot of things going on in the world right now, as you know, with the coronavirus. And I really need information and facts because I don't deal with political rhetoric. You know how I feel about that. You know, and I just want to give the listeners and viewers, the people tuning in, you know, a little sense of like really what the scientific world is fighting right now. So I would like to ask you, since you do work in clinical research and they're talking about vaccines and FDA approval, a bunch of scientific jargon that a lot of us may not understand, could you really explain to the American public, you know, what it really takes to fight a virus of this magnitude?
Well, I think one of the important things to note is everyone thinks a vaccine is going to solve everything and it's going to happen overnight. When you work in clinical trials, there's so many different aspects of actually carrying out the research. It starts in the lab. So someone, you know, scientists have to be in a lab. They have to think of different vectors. They have to think of the biology behind it, right? So they have to make sure that you have chemists, the biologists on board. And a very basic level, that's where everything starts first. This concept, this notion of this specific drug is going to be beneficial or this specific vaccine, whatever it may be, it starts off in the lab. And it starts off with the scientists working on their end, working with animals. So first they have to work on the mice, and then actually after the mice, they have to work with, you know, primates who are much more, their biology is much more in tune with us as humans. And so it's a different level of, you know, the intricacies when it comes to lab work. When that actually gets approved, once that moves on to a different level, you actually have to then negotiate contracts and you have to recruit what they call the institutions or the different research sites that are actually going to carry out these trials. Now that they have this drug that they've tested on animals, they have to test it out on humans. And when they do that, it has to be a very controlled setting. When you do clinical trials, you have to make sure that not only are you following the institutional guidelines, you're following the FDA guidelines, but above all else, you have to make sure that a patient's safety is the utmost importance. And that's where regulatory comes in. That's where contracts come in. You have to set up so many different parameters. And that's the area that I work in. I work in clinical operations management. And basically doing that means making sure that everyone who is a part of that study team carrying out this clinical research is doing their part and is doing their part correctly, not only on a good clinical practice level and following human subject protection rights, but also doing it on a federal level and following all their specific guidelines. And so there's so many elements with regards to that. And then after you recruit a massive amount, and you want to recruit a good amount of patients on these clinical trials because you want your, and this is something that probably comes out in the news all the time, are the statistics behind the success of a vaccine or the number of people that were actually tested. If you're testing out 10 people and you see an overwhelming response, that's a positive indicator. But if you're testing, say, 10 people and only 2 people respond, well, now you have to dig in to see why that was. And, you know, not everyone's the same. Not everyone's, body is the same. Not everyone reacts the same way to a specific drug or a vaccine or whatever it may be that you're testing out when it comes to the clinical trials. So you want your N, you want your population size to be as big as possible. You want to recruit as many people as possible to be able to successfully say when you're actually doing your statistics, your biostats behind it, this is a good indicator. This is going to be efficient, not for a small population, but for the mass. So for a big population of a set community or, just, whoever is actually going to partake with vaccines. So I think what they're doing now, and they're trying to speed everything up, you have your pros and your cons because you want to be able to successfully have a vaccine that's going to be out in the market and it's going to be helpful for everyone. But you have to make sure that throughout this whole process, everything is done in a very meticulous manner. And that regulatory component, which is what I work in specifically, is making sure that everything is documented from serious adverse events, because that's exactly, if you ever pick up a medicine over the counter and you kind of read that fine print or reactions of how someone's going to react to a specific drug, those are all close parameters. Those are very tracked in a very meticulous manner. We have specific adverse events that have been seen in the mice population. We have specific adverse events we've seen in the primates. And now when we're testing it on human subjects, we really don't know what's gonna happen. And so you also have different phases of a clinical trial. You have that phase 1, you have that phase 2, and that phase 3 trial, because you have to test it out first in specific populations before it actually goes and gets FDA approved. So I think it's a great thing that people are getting on board and are trying to carry out these clinical trials for a vaccine. But I think it's gray area because it's a world that was unknown prior to COVID. Really, I don't think that anyone really thought that it was going to, amass to what it's now. And I think it's a good direction to go in, but it's something that as researchers, you have to pay close attention to what's happening with reactions, body reactions, and the way that, people are actually either benefiting from it or is it going to cause more harm than good.
Yeah, it's a very delicate situation. And like you say, it's in phases, and like you never know. I mean, I would imagine you don't know how long those phases are going to last.
Well, we do. When you actually do clinical trials, you're setting specific objectives,
Okay.
right? So when you actually create, say, for example, you create a phase 1 clinical trial, you want to make sure that you're testing, the first step is testing it in humans, right? So a phase 1 clinical trial is going to test the safety, the side effects, what best dose, and that way you're timing that new treatment. So from there, we set specific parameters, and you're setting a specific time point. And again, you're basing everything off of what you've seen in the lab thus far. And then from that point on, you would move on to phase 2 and so on. And so by the time you get to phase 3, you're actually conducting this clinical research to confirm and expand on that safety and the effectiveness of the actual phase 1 and phase 2 of the trial. So you're comparing that between phase 1 and phase 2, you're comparing the drug to standard therapies. Now, the thing with COVID is we don't know really what that standard therapy really looks like, because this is something that was unknown, something that's being treated really just in a case-by-case scenario. We're kind of figuring it out as we go. There was no research behind this, so we won't know what that standard therapy really means. So that's what phase 1 and phase 2 typically do. They compare the drug to standard therapies for that specific disease or the condition that's being studied. And with phase 3, you're confirming and you're expanding that safety and the effectiveness of the drug. So as you can see, there's so many different phases with regards to a clinical trial that it could take years before a vaccine is approved by the FDA and is actually out in the market for everyone to purchase or, for physicians to use. And I think that right now everything's been put in lightning bolt, right? We're trying to kind of speed through all these different processes before we actually carry out and actually produce this vaccine.
Do you feel like,
public.
sorry to interrupt you, but
No
there's been a drug thrown out there, hydrochloroquine. And do you feel like, that information should have been played closer to the chest instead of, like advertising that as like the miracle drug? Like you feel like the administration made a big mistake doing that?
Well, I'm not going to talk politics, but I am not very fond
No,
of,
I'm talking like scientifically. Like, is that something that people usually do? Like, you don't go out on a limb on a drug if you don't know.
Well, no, by all. No, I mean, that's the first thing that you do when you're doing clinical trials is you have to list. And one important thing also to kind of talk about is not only the way that drug is going to develop within you or how you're going to react to that drug in itself, but you also have to think of like other medications that you're currently taking. So if you take a healthy person and you test, that's the ideal population really when you're trying to test out a drug, right? A healthy person who has no other factors that come into play. You're not taking, a much older population. You're not taking someone that has other, comorbid, ailments or whatever it may be. But when you're testing this drug, you don't know how it's going to actually have an effect on another drug you're currently taking. So if you've ever had a physician prescribe a drug to you, they're going to ask you beforehand, what other medications are you taking? When you go and see your doctor's office, they're going to ask you to list all the other medications you're taking because they want to make sure that whatever drug they do give you is not going to have a negative side effect on because of it interacting with the current drug that you're taking. And so with regards to, this drug, the miracle drug that you're referring to, it has side effects in itself. You're talking about headaches and dizziness and nausea and vomiting, a lot of other things that actually have come about because of COVID. And so I don't think that it, at the very least from a scientific perspective, you should really jump on to say, this is a miracle drug, this is going to be the cure-all. We don't know whether or not it's going to be effective with everyone. We don't know whether or not it's going to be the solution. But I think that that's the problem that we're running into right now with regards to this is no one knows really how it's going to play out. No one knows whether or not this specific drug is going to be the solution to everything. And so you really have to kind of do your research. Yeah. You have to kind of see whether or not you I've heard so many stories of healthy people, and that's something that you hear in the news, healthy people who have been now on respirators with COVID, due to COVID. What do you think is going to end up happening with regards to someone who already has all these other ailments, and then they're taking this new medication thinking this is going to solve the situation? You don't know how that person's going to react, and that's where really clinical research is really key, because you want to test out these things in a confined, in a closed environment where you're able to see whether or not this is going to be effective versus, kill someone.
And that's been a big issue, not knowing that much about COVID. Like, what have you learned so far? What makes COVID so dangerous? I hear that it's attacking a certain enzyme in your cells. Could you elaborate a little bit more? Because I would like to know a little bit more about the science behind why COVID is so deadly.
I think that it's just because it's unknown. So that's one thing that you're discussing is the fact that, and I don't necessarily work with COVID, with any COVID patients, and I don't have any clinical research experience with COVID myself, but just, when you're reading, I think, most of the information in the news with regards to how people are interacting, it's attacking, it's really attacking on different levels. And it's really something where we don't know whether or not it's airborne, right? So there's speculation as to whether or not this is airborne. Is it something where it's just a fact of contamination? So if we would do a decontamination of everything with regards to what we touch and who we interact and things like that. But I think the more important aspect of it is the unknown, as you mentioned, and I unfortunately can't really jump into the science behind it myself because I'm not an expert by any means with regards to COVID or how that kind of attacks the body in itself. But I will say that the mechanisms of how it's kind of evolving within and how quickly it evolves within the body is what really is frightening, really, to the scientific community, because it doesn't give you much time to assess how to attack it. It doesn't give you much time to know what kind of medications are going to be efficient in the long run, much more so than I think the medical community is really just trying to keep people stabilized as much as possible, because of the fact that they don't really know whether or not that's going to be beneficial for patients.
Okay, I have one more question before we move on to the next topics at hand. Plasma treatment. Why is that so important? I've been hearing those words being thrown around.
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen with plasma treatment, or that we read, is how important it is for us to be able to, everyone that has been, recovered from COVID-19 and they can donate blood, they can assess this blood. They can assess it in a controlled setting and research, and assess the therapies and assess therapy within a trial, right? So that's where plasma comes in. So when a person that has COVID, their immune system is attacked, it creates antibodies that can attack that virus. And so if these antibodies are actually are produced, then we can, by having that person who has recovered from COVID, by having them donate their blood, we can actually look at these antibodies and see how that helped in attacking the virus, and create them so that we might be able to have that in a patient who is unable to create those antibodies. And so I think, one thing to know about, I'm a big proponent of blood donation. I do it all the time. I haven't been able to do it, but these antibodies within our cells are found in plasma, and they're the liquid portion of the blood. And it's not just necessarily COVID, but they've used it for other therapies. And I think that was the smartest approach to take. I think that we can see whether or not COVID-19 patients are able to recover in a better way through their blood, through their antibodies, through the plasma. And so I think to me, I'm much more excited in seeing what develops in terms of research with plasma in that manner than, say, for example, creating a vaccine, because there's so many different elements of vaccine, and we don't know really how everyone's going to react to these vaccines. But, those trials that are investigating whether or not, plasma transfusions can help improve COVID-19 patients' speed of recovery and increase their chances of survival. I think that that's really where the research should be focused on.
And I appreciate the level of passion that you have for your work. And, it makes me so proud that you come from New York City. You're from the BX. Could you just explain that wild ride from, what neighborhood did you grow up in over there?
No, the South Bronx. And I'm
South
sorry
Bronx.
for all the Jennifer Lopez fans.
Yes.
That is not really the hood. I can't,
Doesn't need to
all
be,
about the
man.
six
You're from
train,
one of
but-
the 5 boroughs. That's the point that I'm trying to make it. It makes me proud.
I just, I was born and raised on 175th and Jerome, that corner, which recently came out in the Law and Order episode, and I can't begin to tell you how exciting that was for me just to see my hood. I know that it's not probably the best indicator of we came on up, but I thought it was just hilarious. Anyways, born and raised in the Bronx. My parents still live in the same apartment that I was born. And I grew up in a very tough environment. Everyone around me, I had a great support system. So, but you saw so many different things. I will always remember there was like a shooting right across from where I live. And the bullet actually hit the window of my bedroom, and I didn't realize it until maybe a couple days later. And it was one of those situations where, unfortunately, it was like, oh, okay. And, it happens. That's what happened in the hood. But at the same time, I had a great support system. I had so many friends in that neighborhood that I still speak to this day. And even though, a couple of them have gone off to different states and have raised their families, I still have such a connection to my roots. I really don't know that many people now that are in that neighborhood because everyone's moved on. But I'm incredibly proud of being from the hood. I took the 4 train to go to high school. I took the 4 train when I went to college. I stayed there until in my late 20s when I finally moved out of my parents, and then just started focusing a little bit more on my career development.
So there was no bullying situations, you weren't nerd shamed growing up or anything of that nature?
Of course. I mean, growing up, I was no more than like 90 something pounds. I mean, I think that was probably the biggest I got until you hit your freshman 15, and then I finally hit the hundreds. But I was always skinny. I was always the nerd, and I was always the underdog when it came to everything. And I think that because of that, my parents kind of tried to not include me much more in sports with regards to like basketball or anything like that, team sports. But I started playing tennis, and that's how you and I met.
Yes.
Right. But because I was just a loner in that sense, in school, I always wanted to just kind of be, one step ahead. And, my parents really instilled in me that, drive to get out of the hood with your education, right? I mean, for my parents, it was incredibly important for me to focus on my studies. They were working 2-3 jobs. It didn't matter to them. So when I hit, working age, they didn't want me to work. They wanted me to focus on school, and they wanted me to, that was my outlet. So yeah, of course I was bullied. I don't remember how many times being told that a lifesaver could be my hula hoop or something like that when I was like young, but it was motivating for me to just kind of focus my attention elsewhere. I think I still had a lot of friends growing up. I wasn't really, alone in a corner, but, it made it for difficult situations during elementary school, junior high. By the time I got to high school, I went to an all-girl Catholic high school, Mount St. Ursula in the Bronx. And so everyone was already dealing with their own demons and their own issues there because all of us were cooped up, all women were cooped up in a building. So it was a little different. By the time I got to college, I was much more able to express myself fully, and just found like great little groups of people to hang out with. And I mean, NYU, you're in the middle of the city, right?
Yeah, you're right
it's
there.
Not like, oh yeah.
No, right, and you're right in the middle of the city, and I really have issues with the fact that you got bullied, and it hurts to hear that, but you've had that drive, and and you speak on education being such an important factor, that drive to get educated, such an important factor. And I have these issues and these these disagreements with a lot of friends that just say, oh, entrepreneurship is the way out, this, that. Like, I understand that, but everybody lives on different bandwidths, and you've been able to attain a successful career in what you do in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And Linda, I want to know your thoughts. Like, look, 16%, right, of the workforce in America, Latinos is 16%, right? And the problem where I see there is that only 6% of that workforce is in STEM. And there's 17.3 million jobs available right now, an increase in 62% over the last 10 years. And I just want to know why, Linda. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we're underrepresented in these workforces?
I think the encouragement is not there, unfortunately. I think it's incredibly, I see it now when I read in the news, and you have, brave women come out and talk about their journey. And if they're, like you mentioned, Latinas, to me, that's incredibly uplifting as an adult, right? As an adult, being able to say, wow, if she was able to do it. So I can't imagine you being young and then not having that kind of representation. How else, do you feel motivated to, like you say, go into STEM and know that there's so many different careers you can take from there? When I started off, it was become a doctor, become a nurse. That, being in the medical work field, that was it. Those were like the main things. You're either going to become a doctor or become a nurse. If you ever wanted to become anyone of significant, status, it was doctor, nurse, lawyer. It didn't end up being like that for me. And that's where I was kind of drilled early on was, become a doctor, that when I didn't become a doctor, for my mom, that was discouraging. It was like, oh, it was a letdown, even though, I may have graduated from college or I moved on and got my master's and whatever it may have been. But I think it's the representation. I think it's the lack of resources. I know that when I was growing up, my mom and my dad were working so many different jobs. There weren't after school programs for us. There really weren't. That's something that has recently occurred, I want to say within the last 15, 20 years. But when I was growing up, I didn't have after school programs to be a part of. And even if there were after school programs, they were just kind of tailored to keeping you busy much more so than focusing on an area of expertise or of a specific subject that you wanted to explore. And so I think having that now is incredibly important, but having that in our neighborhoods is really what should be the focus on, to encourage everyone to know that it's not just about becoming a doctor or nurse. And no disrespect to them, I think they do amazing, things. And especially now with COVID, they are our health heroes, but they're able to do their job. And then on the back end, like I was mentioning, you have the scientists, you have the people negotiating those contracts, you have those people telling, the FDA, this is, what we've been doing, and the FDA working with, the study teams closely to kind of assess where the patient safety should really be focused on. And all that takes, knowledge about clinical trials, takes knowledge about the science behind, the study that you're focusing on. It takes the biostatisticians, so all of those that love the numbers and the math behind it, and they need to know how many patients we need to recruit on the study for this to be successful. All of that is something that was completely unknown for me growing up in the South Bronx and going to, this like local school that was maybe, 3 blocks around, from the house or something like that. And it's because we didn't have the representation. We didn't have those resources, those after school programs or anything like that growing up. And it wasn't until I got to college, so we're talking, 18, 19, 20, that I needed to fulfill like a requirement for one of my classes. And I was like, oh, I'll
do this.
Intern in a lab.
Yeah.
I'll intern in a lab. And that's how my career started, because I was pre-med in college, and I just kept thinking, I was like, oh God, these classes, I don't know, like all of my classes were science classes. It was overwhelming for me. And I kept thinking, do I even want to apply to medical school at this point? But during this time, I started doing an internship or volunteering or, shadowing some people, because NYU and other people that I met through NYU opened the doors for me to shadow them, to do these internships. And then I started realizing, oh, I like lab work. Oh, I like the clinical research aspect or the basic science lab research behind this and whatever. And it was a different path to take. And ultimately that led to a job after college. And then that led to another job and, gotten to where I am now. But again, I didn't experience that growing up in the South Bronx.
And you feel
there
satisfied,
were no programs. Right? Yeah, and I mean, you're taking your classes, you're passing your grades. And for me, my parents didn't let me come home with anything below a 90. And so the focus was just be great with what I'm getting, but not explore. And, again, how was I supposed to know how to explore out from what was presented to me in classes, right? So I think it's important for people like myself, for everyone who came up from the hood, and if they don't live in the hood anymore, to go back and kind of see how you're able to be a part of, either their development through donations or participating or volunteering in any of these resources and these after school programs. Or recently my boyfriend was telling me that before COVID, they had asked him to speak at a local high school about his career and how he got to where he is now, because he's a health physicist and he works for the Environmental Protection Agency. And growing up in the middle of nowhere, Texas, as a Latino, how do you know that that's a job you can even get?
Exactly.
Right? So
exactly.
It's that. I think it really should be kind of full circle for us to contribute back to our communities and to be able to help those that are coming up. And I think, represent us being able to represent our communities and say, we came from here, we know what you're going through, but with dedication, knowing the right people too.
Yeah, Linda,
It
if you
doesn't
don't know what's
necessarily
out
mean
there, how you gonna know, how you gonna know that there's so
exactly.
many different ways to be successful, especially with these
Yeah.
jobs in the underbelly and and the important part of society, in science,
Hmm.
math, engineering, technology. Like if you don't know that these things exist, then you're just gonna go with what you see all the time that you deem as success. If you've been able to go
Exactly.
to NYU, you went to the Mount Sinai School of Medicine, George Washington, great programs. You even were published in a medical journal. Is that true? I read that.
I was.
The
I
effect of
was.
random or sequential presentations of targets during robot assisted therapy on children. And that's something that I want to talk to you about because you do a lot of work in this area, and that sounds absolutely amazing. And it's because you've actually dealt personally with this situation and kids dealing with disabilities and cerebral palsy. Could you really describe or elaborate on what motivated you to get into that particular field and write about these things?
So when I worked at my first job right out of NYU, and I was going to school at that point for my master's in public health. I was working in the lab, and it was great. It was, the basic science that we were talking about that kind of starts everything with regards to clinical research. But I knew that I wanted to start working with people because I was in the lab all day long, and I wanted to venture out and see whether other avenues there were for research. And so clinical research was something that I started focusing on, and an opportunity came about to kind of marry what you're talking about, the love for research, but then also working with a very vulnerable population like pediatric, and specifically in this case, there was children with traumatic brain injuries, children with cerebral palsy, in a hospital up in northern New York, so Westchester, let's call it what it is. And I loved it. It was my first experience going into clinical research, so working with the patients that were actually going to be a part of these clinical trials. And what we specifically did for those publications, for those clinical trials that ended up being published were we were trying to target children who had cerebral palsy, children who had traumatic brain injuries due to accidents or whatever may have occurred for them to be the way they were, to give them mobility again, because a lot of our children were paralyzed from the right or the left, and they weren't able to do much anymore with their with whatever limb they had paralyzed. And so we started kind of targeting from a neurological standpoint what we could do to retrain the brain. And one of the reasons why that was so important to me when I started doing that was my brother has developmental disability. He's 5 years younger than I am. And we never really knew what happened, or, according to my mom, he was born healthy, full-term pregnancy. So there was nothing to say that this was like an indication of what was to come. But when he started, his milestones came about. So, he couldn't roll over, he couldn't sit up. We started seeing that there was something, quote unquote wrong, with him. And then special ed became a part of our daily life, and it still is. And it was just important for me to find opportunities to help that community. It was important for me to, and it might not have been a reflection of what's going to help my brother at that moment, but I just knew how difficult it was for my parents to find resources for my brother for speech, for physical therapy, for occupational therapy. And so being a part of that was incredibly, for me, gratifying on a different level, because, someone did that in order for my brother to, be a part of this program for speech, or be a program for occupational therapy or physical therapy. And, it's something that I still keep doing, even though I don't work in clinical research for neurology anymore, and my focus is, shifted. I still participate very much so with programs aimed for those with
Can you give
developmental
them a shout out, the
disabilities.
programs that you work with?
So when I was in Tennessee, I was very lucky to be a part of the Council on Developmental Disabilities, which basically was a group of people that were parents or siblings with people with special needs, with any kind of disability, really being proactive to move legislation for the state of Tennessee for things that they thought were incredibly beneficial for their specific community. So we had one parent who was, had a 19-year-old who was unable to go to the bathroom. And so she would have to change her as, you would change a baby in their diapers. And we have changing tables for babies in bathrooms, but she was a grown 19-year-old. And how are you supposed to do that on a baby changing table or even in a stall? And so she was really pushing for adult changing tables so that whenever she would be able to go to a restaurant with her family, she would be able to change her daughter's diapers, because unfortunately that was something that her daughter couldn't do on her own, right? And so we were trying to push legislation that was targeted to these communities or these specific groups of people that were disabled. And so that was incredibly gratifying to me. And unfortunately, when I moved from Tennessee, I wasn't able to be a part of it, but I still participate by calling into some meetings to provide some input from a sibling perspective, which is why I was asked to come on board because of my involvement with my brother. I've been very loud. I'm part of his life so much so with his plans. Every year he has to have an individualized, specialized kind of, program tailored to him for his focus throughout the next year. So whatever focus that may be, typing, hygiene or, speech. So from a siblings perspective, I've been proactive with that. There's the Sibling Leadership Network that I've been a part of for many years. And I would meet with some siblings in New York, and I carried that relationship on in Tennessee. And I'm, in the middle of starting a new group with in Nevada, because there is no Sibling Leadership Network chapter in Nevada for siblings that really, have to take care of their siblings with special needs. My parents never told me outright, you have to take care of him when we die. But that's always a big concern for my parents is when we pass away, what's going to end up happening to your brother? And I mean, it's just him and I. So I knew that I was going to take care of him. But a lot of other siblings are not in the same boat or are hesitant of being in that boat, or they're overwhelmed with their own life that they're dealing with. And so sometimes they just kind of need that outlet where they need to kind of vent about something, or they need to share resources to help with their decision making, or maybe they have taken over the care of their siblings. So they need some help with regard to that. And so that Sibling Leadership Network is incredibly important because it just is a way for everyone to kind of share what their experience is. Because, maybe someone went through what you're going through right now, or will go through what you're going through right now. So that's a very big passion of mine outside of clinical research. But I think my brother is really kind of, whether or not I thought about it in the beginning, has really kind of helped me develop, I think, in life, and he's been a very big part of my life. He still is. He's living with me in Vegas right now.
Well, you're one of the most altruistic human beings I ever met. And before we end the podcast, I want to ask you, you still running marathons or not?
So a couple pounds later.
Linda's the first person I ever seen run a marathon that I knew personally, So just want to ask you real quick if she's still running before we end the podcast. I was out there on First Avenue in front of my building in Harlem, like, yes, let's go, let's do it.
Well, I can't begin to tell you how much that meant to me, honestly. But my boyfriend and I just signed up for a triathlon. So hopefully, if everything goes well with regards to social distancing and COVID kind of in a way resolving, we're going to run a triathlon in Nevada in October.
Cool.
So let's just hope that happens.
I look forward to that. Now, Linda, are there any social media handles that we should know about before we end the podcast right now?
I am happy to send you some, but of course, for anyone that has, a sibling with special needs, the Sibling Leadership Network is incredibly important. There are a couple. They're on Facebook. They send out listservs all the time, so I think that's incredibly important for everyone to know. I think it's also good to keep up to date with what's happening with the CDC. That's my kind of go-to forum when it comes to updates with what's going on. Not necessarily a news outlet. I think that it's incredibly important for everyone to know a little bit about clinical research. And so, not necessarily a handle, but, Google to try to kind of figure out how everything comes to play before a vaccine it gets approved by the FDA.
All right.
And I think that's it for me.
All right. Well, we were talking with scientist of clinical research, Miss Linda Monterroso. Thank you for joining the Angel of Podcast, love. It was great talking to you, and we appreciate you being here and dropping the knowledge.
Thank you.
All right.
I appreciate it, Angel.
Cool. We'll talk to you later. All right, baby? Be good.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my interview today with clinical research expert Linda Monterroso. And to continue following me on YouTube, just click on the notification bell. Also, like and comment. Let me know what you're thinking. You can also follow me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts at the Angel of Words Podcast. And if you're interested in seeing my shenanigans on social media, follow me at Angel of Words ENT. Thank you for tuning in, my people. Talk to you later.